Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tuula Helne, and I work here at the research unit. And I have the great pleasure of welcoming Professor Max Koch to Helsinki and to Kela. And before I ask him to step onto the podium, I'd just like to say a few words. A month ago, I participated at a sustainability conference in Germany. The conference was titled Leverage Points, and the title pointed to the need for finding levers of intervention for fundamentally changing the current ecologically unsustainable social system. In other words, the focus was on how to restructure our institutions, how to reconnect humans to nature, and how to rethink what we believe we know. These three R's, restructuring, reconnecting, and rethinking, should also be the concern of mainstream social policy. But mainstream social policy, however, is still entrenched in customary ideas about the necessity of economic growth and social policy as a factor of this growth. It thus disregards the ecological devastation the relentless pursuit of economic growth has left in its wake, and turns a blind eye to the connection between human well-being and planetary well-being. I strongly believe that there is a need to bridge the gap between the two, and that social policy has to find new lenses and new conceptual tools, one of them being sustainable well-being or sustainable welfare, the concept that Max uses in his writings. So we first need a new vision, and then we need tools for transforming this vision into practice. And we'll shortly hear what Max has to say about this. Instead of talking about Max's CV, I wanted to open this seminar by telling you what he answered when I asked him why he is interested in sustainable welfare. Max told me that he first became interested in climate change and environmental issues on a personal level. He made some changes in his lifestyle, but being a sociologist, he soon saw that this would not be enough. So he started combining his previous work on political economy, welfare, employment, and social inequality with issues of environmental sustainability. So could I say, Max, that you started reconnecting? Max also found colleagues with the same aim from diverse faculties at the University of Lund, and together with them he started asking what it takes to provide welfare within planetary boundaries for all people now and in the future. This is not what one could call a small question, but I think it's the time in human history when small questions simply won't do. It's also crucial that we ask the right questions, as Max and his colleagues are doing. And I believe we are going to hear the answer, or part of the answer, now. So welcome warmly again, Max.
Thanks, Tuula, for this very nice introduction. Thanks for coming, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. And yeah, as Tuula said, yeah, well, it has to do with some big question. That's probably fair to say, and I probably should also say that if you then expect big answers to all of them, then you can go home probably disappointed. But sometimes just posing some right questions can be, well, at least a step in the right direction. I want to talk about the following things. Well, assuming that as this is, as far as I understood it, a more kind of traditional social policy and welfare institution, I thought I introduce you a little bit to the discussion on planetary boundaries, climate change, and, well, the existing public policy. We will ask empirically whether the mainstream policy answer to these issues is enough, which is green growth, and also whether the particular answers that Nordic countries give are, well, so to speak, sufficient in combining welfare and sustainability goals. We will then turn to some alternative approaches, degrowth and sustainable welfare. Especially the latter approach has been developed by colleagues and myself in Lund. We will then look at the rather massive structural challenges that this brings about, kind of challenging the growth imperative. We will see how this hangs together at the moment with the range of institutions and also with the generation of well-being that doesn't make this kind of transition that a lot of, that actually the mainstream of climate scientists say is necessary, but it makes it a lot more complicated. And I will stop by describing some ways forward, at least, without being able to give the answers totally. So if we first talk about planetary limits and climate change, so there's basically so that there are certain planetary boundaries, 12 are usually identified. Climate change, biodiversity, the nitrogen cycle are 3 of them, and they are either being approached or crossed at the moment. In the case of climate change, greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere will result in temperature rise of between 1.5 and 4.8% by 2100. That's according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which basically summarizes the world knowledge on the issue. And sometimes it's forgotten that the warming will, of course, go on after 2100. So there's an accumulation of warming going on. And of course, especially in welfare theorizing, we should also be concerned about the generations that come after us. Just to give you some idea what it might mean if we end up in the higher end of this spectrum, 4 degrees would mean 70% of the world population would be exposed to deadly heat stress. 3 degrees would be a crucial factor for the extinction of 50% of the currently existing species. And the IPCC more recently carried out that we have only 12 years, and that is already down now again by half a year, let's say 11 and a half years, to implement substantial policy changes in order to have a fair chance to keep warming well below the 2 degrees mark that the Paris Agreement identifies. And as social policy scholars, you probably are aware of the cases if such policy is supposed to be implemented in that time, that means it would need to be decided about today. Yeah, as you know, I was talking about this in Brussels actually with EU commissioners in December, and they tell me how long this can take. You know? And that is not a specific thing for environmental policy, but for all kinds of policies. It takes a lot of time to agree on them before they are implemented. So the whole thing is very urgent. And it is by no way exaggerated to say that we are in an existential crisis, in the sense that, well, not only our species, but actually a lot of others are, well, threatened. What is the EU main policy answer to that? There are actually quite ambitious climate targets, which are probably up to the task. They plan to have carbon reductions of 20% by 2020. Well, that is very soon. 40% by 2030 and 80 to 95% by 2050. And the magic word by which all this is to be achieved is green growth. That means that economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability can be achieved at once, at the same time. You can ask, if you look a little bit more into European policy making, whether the three are really on equal footing, if one considers that actually environmental sustainable has just been excluded from the so-called European semester. That is basically the growth prospects which are done every year, which are then kind of tried to bring together with certain social targets. So before that, environment was in there, but not anymore. So anyway, the idea is to simultaneously reduce energy and material costs and the EU's reliance on the geopolitics of energy supply. And the second magic word after green growth is decoupling here. And that means decoupling of economic growth, material resource use, and carbon emissions. And it is important to distinguish here between absolute and relative decoupling. So relative decoupling can happen when or does happen when the resource share of one produced euro goes down and the energy share. But that can be overcompensated if the overall cake grows, so to speak. And for the climate, we need absolute decoupling. That means that the resource use and the carbon emission and all the other greenhouse gas emissions go down in absolute terms, and they need to do so quite substantially, as I have tried to show. For this, we have actually no empirical evidence. In 2018, again, the world's CO2 emissions grew by 2.7%. 2017 was similar. So we are very, very far from coming only close to these kind of targets that the Paris Agreement has identified. Now, another way of looking at that, and that may be of interest for a welfare institution, is how different welfare regimes are doing in terms of reducing carbon emissions. There was the thesis by, for example, James Meadowcroft, also Ian Gough. They were saying that social democratic welfare states were best placed to also build the environmental states, because there were a lot of institutions already in place that could be used, so to speak, as a basis for also building environmental institutions. So that's one. I will look at two empirical papers we have done to give you an idea about the background from which we discuss sustainable welfare. So we used Esping-Anderson's well-known terminology about operationalizing welfare. That is, of course, decommodification, the overall expenditure for social protection as percent of GDP, and stratification, income inequality, and Gini index. And then we looked at a few ecology performance indicators like electricity generated from renewable sources, CO2 emissions per capita, national ecological footprints, and also environmental taxes and public expenditures for environmental protection. And then we carried out a correspondence analysis. So the sociologists amongst you will know that maybe from Bourdieu's work on In Distinction, where it was about taste, basically how taste is related to various sorts of capital. I think that was Bourdieu was the one who made correspondence analysis very popular in the social sciences. We've done, my colleague Martin Fritz and I, we've done that in terms of welfare and ecology. So is it actually true, as Meadowcroft and Gough at the time hypothesized, that the social democratic welfare systems also perform best in environmental terms? Well, you can read this graph. I don't know if, yeah, I think it's probably big enough that you find the different country codes there. So in the middle, so right there in the center, that would be basically the area of the map where welfare and ecology intersects. So where you, on the welfare plus side, you find actually, surprise, surprise, all the Nordic countries. So we basically proved for the maybe 2000th time that the Nordic welfare regimes are doing best in doing something about inequality. But they are not doing so in terms of environmental performance. That would be the area of ecology plus. There is only actually Sweden, which would be in this kind of area of synergy. Sweden is right up there. And well, then if you look a little bit at Sweden's performance, much of it is actually down to the use of water power. So that really influences the Swedish performance in a positive way. Whilst in the other Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Norway, they are performing well on welfare, but not particularly on environmental issues. So the synergy hypothesis doesn't seem to apply very much. The opposite might actually be true. And here we are in the area of kind of sociology 101. You know, the key problem of sociology is that we act with intentions, but very often there are unintended consequences of these actions. So the welfare system was obviously not built to do something about environmental issues. It was built to do something about inequality. But now it could be that the same mechanisms that do something about inequality, that give people, for example, a minimum income, allow them a certain lifestyle, the same redistribution mechanisms bring people actually in the situation to live environmentally harmful lifestyles. Culminating in the fact that a lot of my fellow people in Sweden think it's a kind of human right to fly to Thailand twice or three times a year. And you know the environmental impact of flying. I don't have to tell you about that. So that could be a more or less classical example for, having an unintended consequences of intended action. What we found already here are actually countries that come relative close to the environmental performance area, so where countries are doing relatively well on the environmental side. There we have countries such as Turkey, for example, or Portugal. And these are countries whose GDP is far below that, for example, of the Nordic countries. So already in that article from 5 years ago, we found a rather strong link between GDP per capita and environmental ills. And that became confirmed in another study we've done, this time on a global level. Here we were looking at, I think it was 150 44 countries. That comes close to the world population. There are, I think, 170 countries, but some of them we don't have data. And we looked at, again with Martin Fritz, we looked at ecological sustainability, some standard indicators like CO2 emissions per capita, ecological footprint of production and consumption. We looked also at some social inclusion indicators, quite classical ones like Gini index, homicide rate, also democracy index, and what we call quality of life or individual indicators such as life expectancy and also subjective well-being. And then we divided basically the countries of the world into basically what they were earning per person. In those group of countries, and we made more or less the same sizes of clusters here. In those countries we call poor people earn less than $3,200 a year. Developing is they earn between 3,200 and 11,000. Emerging and rich. Most of the world that we inhabit is in that group, where people on average earn between 21,000 and 50,000 dollars. So that includes Denmark and Sweden, for example. I think also Finland. Then there was a country of one sample of just 8 countries, because there were really statistical, they stood out because people were so incredibly rich there. And that is on average. Yeah? And that is in the oil exporting countries, but also in Norway and in Switzerland. And if you look at these data, then you find that social inclusion and quality of life indicators grow with GDP per capita, including subjective well-being, as I have to remember sometimes some of my degrowth colleagues. So basically, the richer, the better off, and the happier people are. But if you look at the ecological sustainability indicators as well, then you have to tell a little bit different stories. Then the story would be the richer, the happier, and the dirtier too. Basically, the richer we get, the more we emit. And we wouldn't, just to give you an idea of the extent to which our energy and matter throughput would need to diminish to kind of become re-embedded into planetary boundaries, then we would need to go down to the level of the developing countries. That could be seen as within planetary limits. So for most of our part of the world, that would be a reduction of more than 50% of the, rather actually 60 or 70 of the matter and energy we use. So this is quite substantial, and this is also why I give this kind of graph the title "No Alternative to Degrowth." And I'm well, you could say that Margaret Thatcher was a kind of degrowther by disaster in many ways, yeah, because you can actually say that during Margaret Thatcher's time in the UK, actually CO2 emissions went down. That was basically down to a massive deindustrialization politics she's done. But this is not specifically, or in the first place, what degrowthers mean. Yeah, so there is a difference between this kind of depression and a planned downsizing of the energy and matter throughput, and this and also in a democratic way. This is whether you like the word or not. I'm happy to discuss other words than degrowth also, but that is about the directions we have to take. At least if we don't want to say we don't care about other people's welfare, it's only the welfare of the happy few in the West and North that is of interest, while everybody else can, well, either die of thirst or of heat or, well, whatever. So to summarize this first part, the conclusion is green growth will not be enough. So I want to be understood correctly, and that means I'm of course not against green growth in the sense that I'm happy for any renewable energy that is being applied, but I don't think, and many of my colleagues don't either, that this will be enough to meet the Paris targets that we have given ourselves. So while the resource use declined relative to GDP in some EU countries, actually not in all of them, this has either not been the case in absolute terms at all, or not to the required extent to meet the Paris targets. And if EU policies, the currently existing policies in the EU itself and in its member states were applied globally, the temperature rise would be 3.2 degrees in 2100. Well, you can say that's better than, for example, in China and Russia or Canada, whose policies would result in 5 degrees. But on the other hand, well, it also shows you that we have a very long way to go and don't have much time for this long way to take this distance. And it is even like rather mainstream organizations such as the European Environmental Agency that concludes from all these data that major transformations in the EU socio-technical systems such as energy, food, mobility and urban systems need to take place rather soon to have a fair chance of basically leaving this planet in a condition that our children and grandchildren will have also a fair chance to be enjoying it. So this was a long introduction, but I think it was necessary to give you some ideas why we actually start thinking about these ways. How can welfare be understood in the absence of economic growth, or as degrowthers have, that we would actually need to understand the economy in totally different terms, not so much anymore as a monetary process, but as a biophysical one. So the goal would be to bring the matter and energy throughput in line with the capacities of the Earth's ecosystems while redistributing wealth to promote well-being and facilitate the corresponding social and ecological transition. Well, this is why we organize degrowth conferences, for example, to basically try to understand how this could be done. And as a kind of special discipline within that, we have kind of looked at in Lund, from people from various faculties came together and doing that, how we can actually make welfare theories, systems and policies compatible with principles of environmental sustainability. If you take climate change, then that is a transnational and a transgenerational phenomenon in the sense that it doesn't really matter for the atmosphere from what point of the globe CO2 is emitted. So if Finland outsources industrial operations to China, that doesn't really help. It may help the Finnish statistics, but it doesn't help the atmosphere. And of course, it's also a transgenerational perspective, because the people that come after us basically have to live with the consequences of our way of being. So we were trying to understand welfare based on two principles, that of universalizability and of intertemporality. When we were discussing well-being in these terms, because that is an important topic within degrowth, because if you change something and the well-being of people goes down too quickly, then it is very unlikely that a government that tries that is being re-elected. So much of the degrowth and also sustainable welfare discussion is about how a minimum in well-being can actually be maintained during a degrowth process, understood as a reduction of matter and energy throughput. Well, there's a certain popularity within degrowth circles with subjective well-being measures via GDP growth. You know that, you know maybe the Easterlin paradox. It could be demonstrated that in countries such as the US, the happiness scores remained constant over a long time, since the 50s basically, even though GDP has been going up all the time. But as I've demonstrated before, that looks a bit different. If you look at a range of countries at the same time, there you find actually still a quite strong link between wealth measured as GDP and subjective well-being. So it may well be that there is a difference between basically the pains from loss and the pleasures from gain. So psychologists, among others, have shown that it is true that lottery winners, for example, experience more or less the same subjective well-being levels after some time. So even though their wealth goes up and they can buy what they want, after some times or so it goes back to where they started from. That is different for people who, for example, were caught up in an accident, lost a limb or something terrible like that. These people's welfare or subjective well-being has been shown to go down also in the long term. Also there are some kind of methodological issues with measuring subjective well-being as opposed to GDP. While one thing, GDP growth, in principle, as every neoclassical economist will tell you, can grow indefinitely. There's always a higher sum than the original sum. Subjective well-being is usually measured on a scale from 0 to 10 or so. And then you have countries such as, especially in the Nordic countries, Denmark always stands out as the happiest country in the world. They have already achieved like 8.5 or 9 on a scale from 0 to 10. And that is very difficult to top. Yeah, so with or without GDP growth, but in some way you're comparing basically different things that are difficult to compare, because one thing can actually grow and the others cannot grow. So the Easterlin paradox may actually be to some extent down to methodological issues. So not least down to these, due to those methodological issues, we came to rather prioritize so-called objective well-being indicators, such as human need. Human need theories were basically tabled in the early 1990s, as Tula and Tully, of course, could tell you a lot about. So we looked at well, two books were written in the early 1990s, as far as I know, more or less independently from each other, that without having contact. That was one by Max Neef and the other by Doyle and Guth. Well, this is the kind of terminology by Doyle and Guth. We don't have to go into the details of need theories here, but it gives you kind of an idea what it is about. The main thing is that there is a kind of not too long list of human needs. In this case, I think it's 11. There are 2 basic human needs, there are only 2 of them, physical and mental health, and then critical autonomy. And then there are universal need satisfiers. There's also a limited number of them that actually are necessary to operationalize the basic human needs. and they are culturally, socially, and locally specific needs satisfiers. So this is a very important area of research these days, one that has been maybe not given enough research funding so far, is basically to see how do we kind of satisfy particular needs currently, and what alternatives and, of course, more sustainable alternatives are there and could be maybe applied. So it is important that this is not only an academic exercise in the sense that it is a kind of top-down things invented by clever academics. Now you satisfy your need in particular ways, a bit like social engineering in Sweden in the 1950s, where the clever social democrats knew even the exact square meter number of a working class family. They always knew best what's for him. This is very much a kind of a dual strategy, as Ian Gough calls it. Basically, on the one hand, experts have an input, of course, here, climate scientists, for example, but then it is important that the society itself, certain communities, come together and reflect on the way they satisfy their needs, and hopefully coming about with alternative and more sustainable ones. So again, I think Ian Gough has done a good job recently in basically applying his a little older needs theory to sustainability and climate change purposes. So to sum up, needs are non-negotiable and non-substitutable, in the sense that if you are thirsty and someone offers you a bicycle, you are still thirsty. Yeah? So there are certain things we need to satisfy, otherwise what follows is serious harm. But then, as I tried to demonstrate with that list, unlike wants, needs are limited, few, and satiable, and in principle compatible with environmental limits, as we have tried to show in one study at the example of food. So this is also maybe an area where social policy can actually make a major contribution, because, of course, for a neoclassical economist, there is no difference between needs and wants. That is a subjective consumer decision, and in which we shouldn't interfere. From a social policy perspective, this is a very important distinctions, which I think we should defend. But if ecological overshoot allows less than the optimal generalizable satisfaction of basic needs, well, so be it. We would need then to find democratic ways to debate possible offsets between the satisfaction of the needs and wants of current and future generations. Here, Ian Gough has come up with a guideline, so to speak, which you could discuss, which I think is quite useful. He says present needs should always take precedence over the basic needs of the future, but basic needs of the future should take precedence over the extravagant luxury of the present. So there is a kind of moral and ethical obligation to think about future generations' needs in social policy making, or generally in public policy making, and of course in the ways how we organize our production and consumption processes. And needs even allow, as I've also shown in the recent article with Milena Büchs, a kind of dialogue with future generations, even though I know that sounds a bit like science fiction, but if this catalog of needs can be accepted for a moment, and there is not so much of a difference between Max Neef and Doyle and Gough here, then future people will have the same needs as those of the present. For example, they will have a need for affiliation, for cognitive and emotional expression, understanding, and critical thought. That means that economy and society now would need to be assessed according to their ability to supply sufficient and appropriate needs satisfiers. basically the whole economy and the whole policy-making system should be reassessed according basically to the provision of sustainable need satisfiers. So that's also a rather massive challenge. Now, I have come so far to say that the mainstream answer to the challenges we are facing, green growth, is going nowhere. It is most unlikely that this will kind of work to the extent that climate scientists regard as necessary. But then I have outlined an alternative, which is basically degrowth of the energy and matter throughput and sustainable welfare and needs orientation in policy making and in the ways we organize the economy. But then I just also want to say that the second alternative is far from easy of being achieved. Yeah, and probably within the degrowth research community, I'm probably one who keeps kind of pointing to this, that this will be a little bit more than basically a few people coming together with good intention, because there a little bit of classical sociology knowledge helps, of course, too, yeah, as usual, actually. Well, if we look a little bit here at this graph, you find that currently a range of institutions, no? We could the welfare state to start with, but also others, the media, the legal system, education, all these institutions are coupled to the market economy and economic growth. About welfare, state provision, for example, we are here in an institution that specializes on pensions. Yeah, in some way, not only, of course it is more difficult to provide pension payments in a situation where the economic cake diminishes and not grows anymore. That and of course, if we change one of these institutions, the political system, the media, that has repercussions for the others too. And so this is basically from our book, Post-Growth and Well-Being, and Milena Books and my book. So what we would need to achieve, actually, is a parallel change of a whole range of institutions in roughly the same speed. If we change only one or two of these institutions and the others remain the same, or if they change in very different speeds, the result will be very similar to what happened in the 19th century, which Emile Durkheim described as anomie. Anomie is this kind of classical sociological term for the absence of norms and values. Not really the absence, maybe, but there is a miss of compatibility between the norms and values that people have developed during their socialization and the environment now in the sense of social environment, the institutions. So that is basically what happened in the so-called Great Transition, the Great Transformation that Polanyi wrote about. So the change from political, economic, and social changes, political from absolutism to democracy, the changes in the economy from the feudal and to the agriculture-based economy to an industrial economy, and the political changes from the feudal caste to a economic class society. Of course, and not accidentally, that was actually the historical origin of sociology. Basically, how in Durkheim's question was always, how can we organize, so to speak, or how can we understand in the first place a new kind of moral regulation of all that? And how can we understand solidarity under these quickly changing terms? And you've probably heard from my accent already that I'm from Germany already. And I can just make one short example for a more recent well, a case of enemy. That was East Germany. That was for a sociologist, that is kind of a paradise. For the people that went through it, much less so. In East Germany, you had the case that everything, basically, the political, social, and economic system changed from one day to another, basically overnight in, I think, November 1990. So the German Democratic Republic was not a paradise, but it was a society nevertheless, with a political system where the one existing party was always right. They had an economy with a, you know, the state-planned economy, and they had a social system which was actually not so different from the Swedish one in many ways. A universal social system that changed overnight when the GDR became part of the Federal Republic of Germany. And so now they had political pluralism, they had market economy, and they had a conservative welfare regime, you know, insurance-based welfare regime. And not so different from the 19th century. What you could see was the birth rate went down in Eastern Germany in the 1990s, massively, actually, from over 2 babies per woman to 0.7, if I remember it correctly. The suicide rate went up. All these things, the unemployment rate skyrocketed at the time. So a lot of people were struggling very hard. And I mean, this was an example actually where you still had the rich kind of family people from the West who were transferring big amounts of money to the East, basically to cushion the transition. No one would do this now. That's for sure. Yeah. So there is not a kind of rich degrowth society that could kind of transform means to the poorer ones. So what we have to do, I think we have to do it, and that is basically the only alternative that I see, but I'm happy to discuss other alternatives if you, is a change of a range of institutions in a democratic way, so that the energy and matter throughput can shrink, and that we still satisfy our human needs and maintain a minimum of well-being. We have discussed that a lot when we wrote that book, Post-Growth and Well-Being, and we couldn't come up with any historical example of a democratic change of that caliber. We have to be the first, I'm afraid. And it's sociologists always write and talk about structure and agency. There are a lot of problems at the agency sides too. I keep that maybe a little bit shorter. The growth paradigm is not only inscribed into the institutional structures of contemporary society, it's also inscribed in people's minds and bodies. And even more so, it is perceived as the natural way, the only possible way to steer the economy. You could show that by referring to Marx and Bourdieu. I keep that for another day. So it is inscribed in all these ideas we have, in all our norms and values, the ideas about progress, career, status, competition, cost and benefits, calculations. So not only the institutional setup would need to change in parallel and quick, also the corresponding cultures and values would need to do so. And that doesn't make it any easier either, of course. A last and maybe well, the least big challenge is the role of the state, and that is maybe more a problem for degrowth than for other people. There are a lot of people in the degrowth movement which are very critical to the state, where they think with some justification, I think the state has been more of the problem than of the solution. But when Ines Kosmer and her colleagues basically asked degrowthers what kind of policy changes they would like to see, then the majority answered with rather traditional top-down state policy measures. that was a kind of interesting finding, I think. So there's a contradiction between conceptualizing the state as a kind of external power, incapable of initiating a degrowth transition, and actually politically appealing to it to do precisely this. I come to the last point, and I don't want to leave you in total depression, and try to point out some ways that we may take or not take. We can discuss that. There will be enough time to discuss it. So the first way is basically, how do we understand the crisis in which we are? It is a multidimensional crisis in the sense that it's not only an ecological crisis, there's also unprecedented inequality. This is actually another argument for degrowth, because there it is always discussed together. Inequality and ecological overshoot are tried to understand, to be understood together and be addressed together. But then also authors much more to the mainstream than maybe I am, such as Robert Gordon or Streeck in Germany, they're talking about headwinds to growth resulting from, among other things, financialization and debt, that we may have to consider a post-growth society even though we don't actually like it. So it makes a lot, so if you follow these political economists, and I don't think I have the time to go into the details about their arguments, but the conclusion Streeck and his colleagues are drawing is that we will not get back to this kind of growth rates that Western democracies well enjoyed or not enjoyed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There may be a very small growth rate or no growth at all. So whether we like it or not, to think about a post-growth economy and society may be what we have to do anyway. Well, how is it with alternative discourses then coming across? I was showing before that norms and values would need to change, and quite fundamentally so. Well, then you can probably consult about a person that knows a thing or two about societies. Pierre Bourdieu, he wrote about alternative discourses, such as degrowth, are most likely to become prevalent in periods of crisis affecting either entire societies or certain classes, where the transformations of such or such a part of society determine the collapse, weakening, or obsolescence of traditions or of symbolic systems that provided the principles of their worldview and way of life. He came up with this kind of model. I mean, I took that from his writings and put it into that model. So under what conditions is doxa? Doxa is basically this habitual way of being. Most people do not come up with funny questions. You go to work, you do this and that as if it was the only natural way to be acting. That is basically the normal case, so to speak, where agency is guided by habitus in Bourdieu's terminology. Society is not questioned. The growth paradigm serves as a kind of pensée unique. Yet in a societal crisis, the unity of habitus and practice breaks. And basically, Bourdieu distinguishes between two possibilities here. So we were talking about this enemy problem before, that is also a kind of an outcome of a major societal crisis. So there's first orthodoxa. That means that the social order is upheld by the weakening of democratic institutions and authoritarian rule. That may take the form of what we may call Europe first. Oh, it could be Finland first, or Germany first, or Sweden first. America first is probably most prominent these days. That means that right-wing populist movements defend our Western way of life to the, well, virtually very last drop of blood, really. And that has a lot to do with using the military apparatus to keep the, well, the have-nots of the Northern South in their place, to be able to continuing with our ideas of welfare for as long as possible. And I have to say, an idea of welfare that never was able to be generalized to all people of the world. It was always a privilege, what we are discussing in terms of welfare, and privilege of the happy few in the West and North. The alternative that Bourdieu discussed to orthodoxy was heterodoxa. That is, alternative discourses such as degrowth or sustainable welfare, or you may call it something else, gain ground. That may lead to an eco-social transformation, depending on the coincidence of the crisis and what he called counter-training, an intellectual counter-training. That means that actually spaces need to be created where the normal way of thinking, feeling, and acting are basically kind of set out of functioning. This is basically what is behind these degrowth conferences, that we're trying to achieve other ways of basically interacting with each other. That is quite well described with this in this parallel way to an athlete's training for the Olympic Games also. The growth imperative is not only dominant in our minds, it kind of colonizes our whole body, and a lot of counter training is necessary to do something about that. So spaces needs to be created where the growth imperative ceases, as the Barcelona degrowthers would have it, cease to colonize imaginaries, the way we make sense of the world. My last point, which I will maybe well explain in another 10 minutes or so, is that ecological and social transformation, as opposed to Europe first, can be made more attractive to people if hands-on policy strategies are developed both in top-down and bottom-up perspective. I think I leave that a little bit shorter now. That is something I have done a bit recently, to thinking about the role of the state, especially because the state is so incredibly unpopular within degrowth, so that comes out later this year. So we can discuss first the role of the state in a capitalist growth economy, and then think a little bit about how the state apparatus could be used in the transition to a post-growth economy that's also more sustainable. Basically, I say that at the moment, the state plays distinct roles within economic development, at a spatial target, and within economic, social, and environmentally policy making. I discussed the rule of law, that all political economists see as necessary, that actually equivalents are exchanged, and that you not take the commodities of somewhere else, for example, by using violence, no, which is also an alternative, but you are expected to pay an equivalent for it. And for that to be respected, you need a third institution that is not directly part of the exchange operations. All classical political economists would agree on that. And that's the state. That's basically Max Weber's famous definition of the state, no? The institution that monopolizes the legitimate use of force. Less consensual already is the welfare state. That's why we have these different welfare states. That is the guarantee of the state of a minimum of social inclusion and the legitimization of the remaining social inequality. There were different answers to this in different historical developments on the nation-state basis. And there is lastly the environmental state that addresses problems of externalization and environmental costs. then that has been done mostly on the national level, whilst local levels and transnational levels didn't play a big role. And then economic, social, and environmental policies have been interpreted in particular ways too in this, in terms of the state played particular roles in particular settings in macroeconomic management, in the intermediation of corporatist processes, in the more recently recommodification of labor power, and also in kind of launching environmental policies that are supposed to produce green growth. So while this is more or less on safe ground, I argue with people like Nikos Poulantzas, again Bourdieu and Gramsci, that in principle the state apparatus as it exists can be used to facilitate the kind of transition that we are in need of. That is, in Poulantzas, you always have this idea, he talks about, of the condensation of social forces within the state apparatus. So what goes on within the state is far from independent from what is happening outside of it. So if there is enough bottom-up mobilization, basically the state can actually carry out well, policies that we want to see. Bourdieu, more in relation to social equality, talked quite well of the left hand and the right hand of the state. The left hand was the social insurance system, the welfare state especially, and probably he maybe would agree that it's today also the environmental state, if the environmental state is used to actually cap carbon emissions at some point. And then there was always the right hand of the state, the military, the police, the whole repressive apparatus that, well, for example, Donald Trump is more fond of. Yeah? But what kind what hand of the state, so to speak, takes the upper hand? That is a matter of struggle, yeah? of democratic struggle, which can be influenced from the bottom up. So, but very, very centrally, the whole economic development role would need to change from an orientation of monetary growth to one where the economy is seen as a biophysical process, or in Marxist terms, a transition from exchange value to use value orientations. So states would now ensure that the production and consumption patterns do not exceed environmental limits. They would define limits, also states would define limits for economic and social inequality and steer the governance of public, collective, communal, and private property forms to basically carry out that. The spatial target of the state would be rescaled. That's something that's going on anyway, as social policy scholars would tell you, from the national to both the global and local levels. It would be at the global level where we would need to identify thresholds for matter and energy throughput. As I said in the beginning, climate change is a global issue in the sense that it doesn't really matter from what point you emit carbon or other greenhouse gases. So we need global agreements for some kind. And these agreements, these globally set limits, would delineate the leeway within which national and local economies may evolve. And then we can talk about a range of economic and eco-social policies that might help to bring especially the rich world on track. Sustainable welfare and needs theories might actually help theoretically a little bit to carry out and bring about a redistribution of wealth, income, and pollution rights. I said before that this is not that this cannot work as a top-down process only. The state will only kind of work in these kind of directions if there is enough bottom-up pressure, as for example my colleague Hubert Buch-Hansen makes strong in one of his recent articles. And this is actually something which brings us to get back to the issue of needs satisfaction. I think I have described that already briefly and can keep that a bit short. Both in Gough's dual strategy and Max Neef's human scale development methodology, we have this collective, local, and deliberative element of distinguishing needs from luxuries. So it is what we need also basically to renew democracy and also defending democracy against Europe first, we need a kind of new form of basically including citizens. Initiating a societal debate about how current needs are satisfied and how we may do this otherwise, and also identify limits for maximum satisfaction, including maximum income. That can help if it goes well. It would need to be tried, and it would, of course, have only an advisory function to help review policy goals, behaviors, need satisfiers, and infrastructures. And it can help to facilitate and legitimize the formulation of eco-social policies. And now I'm almost at the end. Social policy has an enormously important role in this to play. Generally, climate policies and ambitious climate targets, such as the one that are set out in the Paris Agreement, they come with distributional dilemmas. That is first true, or it first applies to the global level, and that has been addressed in theories of climate justice, for example. At the global scale, it is those countries that have contributed the least to the problem, that means they have emitted the least, that are in the worst situations to be hit by climate change and to cope with it. So if you take a Bangladeshi, for example, who never flies, who does a lot of other things, never, well, he's the one, or she is the one that may live through, well, floodings and basically well, losing his or her home. So that is true at the global level, but it is also to some extent true at the national level within the rich countries, where you can also show that on the one hand, the richest household groups emit by far the most CO2, whilst the poorest households are in the least good position to cope with, for example, ambitious climate policies. That has been addressed especially in the UK discussion. So if you were to bring all UK houses, if you have been over there in England or Scotland, you know that they are not so well insulated sometimes. If you were to bring all these houses to Finnish standards, that is a good idea, of course, in terms of climate targets. But the question is, as my colleague Milena Bux posted in one of her articles, who bears the brunt? So a lot of British house owners are already now indebted. And to ask them now to put in another 20 or 30,000 pounds to kind of insulate their windows and maybe put up a solar panel on the roof and all that, what falls under climate smart living, is not very popular there. So this is why a lot of social policy theorists within that field of climate change say we need countervailing social policies that actually help to make ambitious climate policies attractive amongst the electorate. because there's the risk that if you ask people to put up another 20,000 or so, that they don't like that government a lot and vote for some others, maybe one that denies climate change totally the next time round. So we can discuss that. I have no time to go through this a lot. So eco-social policies would need to be developed. One, policies that at the same time address climate change and other environmental issues and social inequality issues, including poverty. They need to be identified, discussed, and finally initiated in at least those areas here. Income and wealth limits. We have just wrote a paper which comes out soon in ecological economics about the maybe not so popular idea of having a maximum income ceilings for people. But if we can show that it is specifically the richest 1% that emits really a lot of unproportional amounts of CO2, it would make a lot of sense to cut these kind of incomes and use this wealth for other purposes. But the same is true for working time policies, housing, transport, mobility, energy use, and consumption. We can make some examples later in the discussions, if you like. There is a range of things that good social policy scholars can contribute here. In some ways, it's discussions that are going on in social policy anyway. Yeah, so it gets a bit of a new element here if you also look at the climate. So I come to the conclusion. It makes, and my conclusions are less conclusions, but more maybe suggestions for further research and practice. So we need to understand better the ways in which the growth imperative occupies people's minds and bodies, as well as the potential cracks between structure, habitus, and agency. And this is why I think that we need to create much more spaces and more long-lasting spaces than, for example, at degrowth conferences, where alternative forms of thinking, feeling, and living can be explored. We also need to understand better the complexity of the links between objective and subjective well-being under both growth and degrowth, and the preconditions of the happy few to question their privileges vis-à-vis poor countries and future generations. And here, well, the social sciences have actually a whole catalogue of both theories and methods that, as I think, are a bit underused as up to, in degrowth circles, sustainable welfare circles up to now. And then we need a greater focus on welfare, particularly human needs and hands-on policies. And that is both in bottom-up and top-down perspective. In bottom-up perspective, the design and implementation of democratic and deliberative forums for sustainable needs satisfaction to inform policy planning from below may be one among many other steps that might lead us in the right direction. And in top-down perspective, there's a need for an active and, I dare to use the word, interventionist state with a lot of authorities to basically steer the move towards a post-growth economy. And we need targeted eco-social policies at all levels. Many thanks.
Thank you, Max, for this really, really good talk and interesting talk. We have 15 minutes for questions, and when you ask questions, please use the microphone because of the streaming. Yes, okay. I want already, Max, that it's maybe a few minutes before anybody. Okay, here we have the first one. Tuuli, please introduce yourself also. If you...
Yes, hello, I'm Tuuli Arasmaa. I'm representing the degrowth movement of Finland, or if we can call it a movement. Thanks for the great talk. I would like to ask about democracy, because now we were talking a lot about the interventionist state and maybe more of the top-down part of the policy making. And then yet you were talking a lot about this like need for reforming institutions and very substantial changes that we need in order to reach the targets. But democracy is very slow. So I would like to ask, like, should we somehow admit that in order to do those changes, we need to have like fast track decision making, or we need to bypass some of the democratic values? And maybe like in more practical way, what would be your message if we're having parliamentary elections in Finland in April? So for the newly elected members of the parliament, like what would be your message in that regard? How do we need to make decisions?
Shall we collect a few, or do you want?
If you answer.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's of course a central and crucial question. Well, the short answer would be, why don't you vote for Tuuli? But the long one is, I really think we have to think about two things at the same time, yeah. And maybe this is not very elaborate. On the one hand, we cannot wait for the state to wither away when we have only 10 years, give and take, to make substantial changes. So I think at least in our part of the world, that is probably very different in the southern part of the world, where we have developed a state apparatus. We have to try to use them in some way. And my whole talk and much of our recent work was about how can this be done under democratic circumstances. I would actually rather think we need to provide more democracy than less. When I'm not quite sure about the limits of these deliberative forums or so, but I think it is. I mean, you hear it from political science circles. A lot of people being actually quite unhappy with the way how politics is done at the moment. It's kind of you make your cross every 4 years and then it goes more or less well. To have a more lively democracy, also outside the parliament, may actually the right thing, the right way forward, or it's definitely the way forward that I would like to see. I know there are people who say that we need a kind of green dictatorship also, but this is not what I want to say, and much of my talk wouldn't make sense if that was the way I would be going down, because then I wouldn't need to think about legitimacy and institutions, how they work together or not, because then I would just say l'état c'est moi. But this is not an answer that will probably satisfy you, but it is more of the general direction that I think we should be discussing. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I had a practical request. Could I see the first conclusion slide? If you can scroll
the
back.
first slide?
Yeah, the conclusion slide, the first one. Because
the conclusion slide?
Yes, this one. Thank you.
This one?
And then my question was, so my name is Eva. I am working on postdoc research about post-growth work. And I get invited to some events and places to talk about degrowth as an idea and post-growth and the need of everything that you have used now, the time that we used. And I feel so overwhelmed how to do this shorter. Like today I'm quite into these topics and I still struggled with some things. And for instance, I'm going in a couple of weeks to talk with people that I know aren't so into the topics, and like where is the time to, like with all the institutions we have, and I know there's no one answer to this, but I just wanted to sort of bring up this. What are your experiences with talking to different kinds of people, and how do you take the time to introduce them to these topics?
I think I have very similar experiences. Probably worst was Brussels, I have to say, where these EU commissioners who are co-responsible for all this mess, they were only pointing to what some Chinese people are doing or not doing, which I can't really judge whether they are doing what they say or not. And yeah, I don't think I have any handy formula that you can. I'm not doing election campaigns myself, but I see absolutely what you mean. But I think that this human needs idea can probably be used even in such kind of circumstances. For example, housing would be seen as a need, not so much as a commodity. I don't know so much about the Helsinki housing market, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's kind of similar to the Malmö housing market. But I'm not actually sure. But so kind of providing housing as a human need and not as a commodity that you sell on to make a profit may actually open doors to people who are quite marginalized in that areas or even homeless. And there's a nice book that came out, you probably know it, Housing for Degrowth, that came out a few months ago. This is probably a good way of so kind of exchanging different experiences with that and for Europe. And I mean, that's only one thing that comes to my mind.
Markku Sippola, University of Helsinki. One of the basic functions of the state is to provide safety for the citizens, and this means growth, because the higher growth or the GDP, the more military power you have. And nowadays the military spending is globally increasing rapidly, I think. And so my question is, which degrowth you mean? Do you mean the reduction of the carbon dioxide, that kind of growth, degrowth, or do you mean the reduction of the GDP?
Well, that's
because the consequences for the social policies and other policy areas is very crucial. Yeah, the difference is very crucial.
Degrowth does not mean what is known as negative growth. It means actually to deprioritize that indicator known as GDP and to look at biophysical parameter instead, the energy and matter throughput. So it is not anymore, the whole economy is not anymore seen as only a monetary process that goes up in the good times and down in the bad also. And well, I guess safety would need to be discussed in different terms. Yes, in these conditions in which we are, I think we are in an existential crisis, and I keep to that point. We have, I told that to in Brussels, we have to lead by example, if that possible, and hope that other countries will not take advantage of it, because it's basically one of the last opportunities we have. We are not talking about 100 years, but rather 10 years now. So we have to start reducing our energy and matter throughput, regardless what other countries may be doing. Well, that's my opinion.
Yes, hello, I'm Tuuli Hirvilammi, and I have one question regarding to this about public spending. We here in Finland, we have now a little bit tried to follow the discussion on Green New Deal. Do you think that it's somehow connected to this degrowth transformation or eco-social policies? Could that be one possible approach? I don't know.
I would say Green New Deal is a kind of green growth too. And I hope this became clear enough. I am not against that. I just think it won't be enough. And I think green growth and Green New Deal strategies will rather sooner than later to be transformed into a kind of degrowth strategy. That's the short answer we can.
Thank you. My name is Petteri Kolmonen, and I'd like to present you the question that what kind of social and public policy actions could modern states utilize in order to incentivize more bottom-up actions towards sustainable development?
The question is how the state could utilize influence bottom-up action.
How could states incentivize more? What kind of social and public policy actions could be utilized to incentivize more bottom-up actions towards sustainable?
I was more thinking the other way around actually, but yeah, I mean, if of course the state could support these kind of introduction of these deliberative forums I was talking about, that would be definitely something. But then the state can, in many ways, influence public debate and ways how people think about and feel about things. Think about the smoking ban. It's one of my favorite examples, because I lived in the time in Ireland when it came there about 10, 12, 13 years ago or so. People were saying, oh, if Irish people are not allowed to smoke in a pub anymore, there won't be any decent piece of Irish poetry anymore. And no one will go to the pub in the first place. Well, then they introduced it quite top down, and it showed A, Irish poetry survived, and B, more people than ever before went to the pubs, now including those that can't take the smoke. Which no one actually talked about before. So and my parents told me about discussions of the seat belt in cars. That must have been in the early 70s in Germany anyway. There were discussions at the time whether to use a seat belt would not kind of undermine people's liberty to an extent that cannot be defended. And so, of course, the state can make kind of strong points and influence the ways we think. But at the end of the day, bottom-up mobilization is called bottom-up mobilization because it comes from the citizens, if it comes, and not from the state. It should actually influence state policies rather than the other way around. But if it goes well, and I think it would need to go this way, the two would kind of reinforce each other. And I'm absolutely aware we don't see very much of this at the moment. There's no question about it.
Hi, my name is Lei. I'm a student. I was wondering, related to the previous question, if you've been following the Extinction Rebellion group that started in the UK, whether that's something that you see as the type of bottom-up mobilization that you're talking about, because especially in Finland, there can be quite a lot of inertia towards, citizenship, activism.
Yeah, I don't want to share my views and this and that movement at the moment, but my guess would be we will see more of these kind of things also, and maybe we need that actually, kind of civil disobedience in a society that, well, undermines the possibilities for needs satisfaction of young people such as yourself. you're probably aware also of what's going on in not only in Sweden but actually in a range of countries initiated by a Stockholm schoolgirl. And on Friday, we will have a particular big school strikes, actually across the world, even in Havana, as I was just told. And I don't know whether this is also happening in Helsinki on Friday. This is one thing I wanted to ask you, and I hope it doesn't clash with our session. But anyway, we take this later. Well, I think we are getting more of this, and there will be a lot of wise old men who will say, no, school kids should go to school to learn in the first place and leave the problems to the professionals. But these young people, they're quite aware that the older professionals have actually contributed to the mess that we are in. And in Germany, we had a kind of a funny situation last week where there was one major liberal politician who said, well, it's fair enough if young people articulate their ideas of doing political change, but that shouldn't take place during school times, and they should basically study first and then become a professional, and the professionals knows the answer. The reaction to that was that 12,000 scientists said Greta Thunberg is right, basically, and the young people are absolutely a right to do what they do as long as they don't harm anyone. But I leave it, of course, to you whether you think this is legitimate or not. But I'm quite confident, actually, that we will see more of these kind of issues.
Yes, this was most interesting. I know now why Malmö conference took the Tampere people from Tampere, from the Basic Income Conference. But my name is Anne-Riitta Ketokoski. I have been involved 45 years in the Foreign Service. So I understand this is happening in different addresses. I don't believe Brussels is much to count on if you want to change the world. This is why I wanted to say that just now in New York, 8,000 women from governments and activists and all circles are discussing in the framework of Agenda 2030. And it is going well when you don't think that the father state has his left arm and his right arm, but it's still the same old patriarch that is having the rule of law and democracy and everything. And the change is coming in a cultural way. And it's not only young girls, it's elderly ladies, it's prime ministers from Iceland, it's the Me Too effect on even European culture, may even be on German culture. I'm not too sure, maybe the Kirche, Küche und Kinder lasts longer. But I would believe that you need that type of approach. So I would like to ask how you count that effect from your perspective.
Maybe I should have left out this part of the state here for this audience, because that was more actually for other degrowthers to use also the state apart from everything else. I actually don't think that everything should go through the state, but actually that we need a range of new kind of institutions for our democratic process that we don't have at the moment, and that I'm very happy to hear about that they are developing. And I didn't talk about the state here to dismiss civil society, and if we can use that as an umbrella term to what you are describing. And well, we will need change from all kind of angles, from all kind of groups, and from all kinds of parts of the world, if we have a certain chance of initiating the kind of change that we need to initiate.
I think it's a southern wind coming. It's not only Nordic winds. They blow so cold.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounded so optimistic, so perhaps that would be the right way to finish this seminar. It's now 25 to 5 and it's time to go home. Thank you, Max, for your very interesting and inspirational talk, and thank you all for coming. Hope to see you soon again in an event like this again. And please, there are still vegetables there. So since we don't want to have food waste, please help yourselves. Thank you, and thank you.